All right, everyone, so welcome. Today we're going to cover the listening chapter here on our lecture materials. And here I really want us to think about listening critically for a moment, because so much of being a good public speaker is about being a good listener. In fact, the vast majority of communication time that we spend listening, right? And so it's such a critical skill to work with. I want to just talk about that for a little bit today. The first thing, though, I want you to do is I want you to think real quick about that difference between listening and hearing. In fact, if you have notes, go ahead and pull them out right now, and I'm going to have you jot down just really quick in your own, hit pause here, really quick in your own words. What do you think is hearing? And then what do you think is listening? Most of us have this conception of the difference between these two words. Let's see if yours matches up. So if you want to pause right here. All right, so here's a definition that I'm providing for y'all for listening. So we might think about listening as the conspicuous act of recognizing, understanding, and interpreting the messages of others. Is that close to something you had? Yeah, we typically have this idea that, right, hearing is something a little bit more like, it can go in one ear and out the other. It's more of a physical process that doesn't necessarily involve cognition or the brain, right? But with listening, if we break down this definition, right, it's a conscious act, right? So it's something that we have to actually think about, something we actually have to take effort to think about and do. It's a conscious act of recognizing, so actually being able to see, understanding, being able to think through, and then actively interpreting the messages of others. It's an active process, right? If someone stops us in the middle of something they're saying to us and says, "Can you repeat that back to me?" and we can't do it, we have to ask ourselves if we were actually listening. And this becomes so important because what I really want to talk about today is this idea of being a critical listener and a critical thinker and its connection and tie to public speaking more broadly. So let's talk for a minute about selective perception. I actually got my undergraduate in sort of things related to psychology, neuropsychology. So I'm actually very interested in this stuff, although we're going to keep it real simple since we're in a public speaking class here. Selective perception. So I like to say that perception is like a sieve. So a sieve is that little thing you use to filter out, different sort of materials, right? Thicker materials might maintain on the sieve, whereas thinner materials will pass through the sieve. Well, your perception is like this. Think about it. Let's say I was in a classroom setting, right? If I were to pay attention to every single person moving, shifting in their seat, pulling out a pencil, writing something, scratching their head, scratching their butt, looking around the room, if I was to pay attention to everything in my visual field, and then everything in my auditory field, every shift of every seat, things in my perceptual touch field, if I were to pay attention to the feeling of clothing against my skin, the feeling of the glasses against my face, my shoes on my feet, I probably just made you start thinking about the clothes that you're physically wearing right now. You probably hadn't thought about them in a while. Why? Because we have selective perception. And that's a good thing. Partially because our brains can't handle all of the raw information, all of the raw data going into them through all of our senses all at the same time. We can't do that. We tend to have what are called heuristics. Heuristics. So go ahead and write that down. Heuristics. 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 So heuristics are ways that our brain has of dealing with everyday life situations. For instance, let's say you walk into a lecture hall, right? As a student, what do? You sit down, you plop down with your notes, right? You just plop down with a pen or a pencil, and you pay attention to the person speaking with the great hair, right? And you listen. Why? Why don't you get up and dance on the desks? Well, maybe you would in dance class, but generally, right, you have a heuristic for sitting, focusing the center of your vision on the interesting or important thing that's happening, and kind of disregarding all other information, how your clothing feels, all other kind of stuff, right? You disregard that information because you have a heuristic for dealing with what a lecture might be. Now that's good, in a way, because it means that our brains have the ability to filter out information we don't need. But this leads us to an important problem when it comes time to think about actual critical listening. So we can think about this in hearing. This would be called selective hearing or selective auditory attention in psychology or neuropsychology, right? So with this selective auditory attention, this is essentially the ability to simultaneously recognize some auditory attention while ignoring others, okay? Now, there's a problem with this. It's good in the sense that it's important to focus on what we need to focus on, but it also can cause problems relationally if you have turned off listening to your partner or your instructor or your family members, right? We have selective perception, but when we listen to speakers, or let's get a deeper example here and more to the point that we're going to get into. Let's say you're listening to a speech from a cultural other, someone from a background that's not one that's familiar to you, someone from a culture, from a religion or a country that you're not familiar with. You might have a heuristic that might turn off your listening to them. And that's really a shame, because it means that we're not actually going to listen to that person unless we listen critically, suspend judgments going into that listening event. So let's kind of get into our next little section here. I'd like to talk about this relationship between that and confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is the tendency to overvalue data that supports a pre-existing belief. Again, confirmation bias, the tendency to overvalue data that supports a pre-existing belief. Now, this becomes a really big issue in public speaking, right? Because we have to make sure that if we listen to a speaker that's from a culture that's different from ours, or that's from a perspective that might be different from ours, a part of society, whatever, that might be different from us, we have to make sure that we're actually listening deeply to that speaker and not just turning them off, right? And if that speaker is providing us with new information, you can see the little detail there, right? The idea that you might come into a situation believing or having a certain understanding about the world, but then if you're provided with a speaker or a source of information, of valid, good information, that just provides a lot of examples that are different from the way you entered into that conversation, and you leave that conversation without even considering the information that was given there, that we might call this stereotyping, right? And giving incidents or examples of ways that stereotype that you thought was the case is not actually the case. If you maintain that stereotype afterwards, well, that's a problem. That is confirmation bias. Again, that tendency to overvalue data that supports a pre-existing belief rather than allowing, as a good critical listener, new data, new information to potentially, if it's good data, right? We always want to judge our sources, and we'll get into that a lot later. But to make sure that we're allowing that to potentially change us if it's good information. All right, let's keep on going here. So, as we move forward here, let's think about critical thinking for a minute. So, quick definition. You can write down the top part if you're taking notes here, or just listen here. So, I'm going to break this down. So, what is critical thinking? We hear this word, this term, this idea all the time. Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process. So, it's intellectually disciplined. So, that means we have to actually work at it. So, much like critical listening, we have to work at thinking. It's an intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully, so it's an active process, not just a passive one, something we have to work towards, conceptualizing, analyzing, applying, synthesizing, or evaluating information, so it's an evaluation process. It's this idea that we're going to take new information, we're going to compare it with what we know, and we're going to look at that information objectively, and compare it and think about it, and that's information gathered from or generated by observation. So reading deeply, and well, observation, we really mean, not just seeing something, but rather researching about that thing. What do I observe in the world, but what also can I gain from experience? But also reflection. What happens when I look into this particular issue and look at all the different potential sources that might be talking about this? Reflection, reasoning, or communication, and not just doing all that, but doing that as a guide to belief and action. So doing that constantly, every day. As we get new information in, compare it with information we already know, and research. If it is something that is non-familiar to you, look into that culture, look into that piece of information. And make sure you're looking at your sources. For instance, one thing that comes up a lot, let's say you're pulling from a news source, for instance. Does that news source, for instance, cite its sources? Or does that speaker, as they're talking to you, does that speaker cite where they got their information from? Right? You should always make sure that you are, for instance, pulling from a factual piece of information, right? Whether it be a factual piece of journalism or a piece of information you're getting from a book or a professional source or whatever it might be. You should always make sure that that source is citing its sources, and make sure that, for instance, it's not an opinion piece. So go ahead and write this down if you've never heard this idea before, of the difference between a piece of, for instance, factual journalism and opinion, or sometimes it's called editorial. So opinion or editorial, that is someone's personal opinion, right? So you'll see it sometimes, let's say you're on a news website and you see opinion at the top of a piece. Now that opinion might have been written by a subject matter expert. Their opinion might have some weight, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's not necessarily factual information. If it's listed as opinion or editorial, that's just someone's personal opinion about a thing. It hasn't been, for instance, fact-checked by multiple sources. And we really need to make sure that whatever information we draw from, we're always checking our sources and where our sources are getting that information from. And we'll get into that later when we get into research. But when we think critically, we have to ask ourselves these important questions. In its exemplary form, critical thinking is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions. The goals, the focuses are clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency within a speech, relevance to the speech matter at hand, evidence, good reasoning, depth, breadth, and fairness in relationship to that issue. Now, this comes from criticalthinking.org, but I do think it's good advice in considering what critical thinking is. So we could summarize all that into the idea that critical thinking has two components. First of all, a set of information and belief generating and processing skills. So it's a set of skills. It's the idea that you're going to take information in. You're not going to let your confirmation bias just pass on by. You're going to take that information in. And you're going to have a habit of using those skills to guide behavior. So to go back to selective perception, for instance, we all have a kind of selective perception, especially in terms of hearing. And write down these three things here, because we tend to pay attention to three big things here. We tend to pay attention to what we personally hold to be important. What we hold to be important. We tend to pay attention to information relevant to our own experience and backgrounds. Information relevant to our own personal experience and backgrounds. And third, information relevant to what we know or what we think we know. Third, information relevant to what we know or what we think we know. So first, we tend to pay attention most to what we personally hold to be important. So again, those cultures that I might be personally part of, those social issues, those medical issues, those kinds of things that might directly involve me. If I hear those keywords, those things that are also part of my life, of course, I'm going to pay attention to them. Things about culture, things about religion that I personally have a connection to, I'm going to probably pay more attention to those than other ones. But we have to be careful here. This is where our confirmation bias can really screw us up a little bit, right? Because if we're not paying attention to new sources of information, it's going to make it hard for us to listen fully and completely to a new speaker who might come from a different perspective. Second, we tend to pay attention to information relevant to our own experience and backgrounds. So information relevant to our own experience and backgrounds. Information relevant to our own experience and backgrounds. And that's because we have those experiences. We have those personal experiences, we have those personal backgrounds, and we might over-focus on them when in fact we probably need to pay attention to what all potential listeners to a text, how they might perceive what that speaker is saying. And third, we tend to pay attention to information related to what we know or what we think we know. And that's confirmation bias, right? Just because we think we know something going into a situation doesn't necessarily mean, if you recall that image from earlier, if we get lots of information, lots of data that shows us something different, we should consider changing our way of thinking about that issue. And that is how we become good speakers and good listeners, because we're not just going into a situation with our preconceived notions. We're going into a situation with the ability to understand each other, really listen to each other, even if it's a subject you don't like, even if it's a person you don't want to listen to. If you sit down and you listen to what that person is saying objectively, practicing these good critical thinking skills, and think deeply about it, and think about what they're saying factually, and compare that to what you know, you'll really learn something and you'll have actual conversation instead of people just always speaking over each other. So what is critical thinking not? It's not just the acquisition of information. It's not just the possession of a specific skill, right? It's using these things over time, and this idea that I'm going to constantly and actively listen, compare information, and then do research on these whatever the particular speaker might be getting into. Here's 5 things that I think are excellent things to do. Go ahead and write these down. I highly recommend, as you listen to speakers, think of these as ways of engaging, particularly persuasive speakers, but all speakers really, ways of engaging those speakers to make sure that you are doing some of these critical listening pieces. So the first one is just to evaluate the speaker's evidence. And this is really important, right? So we think about evidence, like I mentioned a minute ago. Is this a personal opinion? Is this speaker even citing their sources? If someone is giving you lots of information, maybe it's a great informational speech, but they give you no sources, you have to ask yourself, where did that information come from? It's one of the reasons why we'll require sources in here. What is that speaker's evidence? And can you look it up yourself? And does the writer of that evidence, where that source of information come from, does that seem credible to you? Does it pass that test for you as a listener? That's important there. Number 2, analyze the speaker's assumption. What is that speaker assuming about you? What does that speaker assume that you are thinking about this issue? Does that actually match with how you think about that issue? Does it really? And in what ways are they assuming things about their audience? And are those things true for all members of that audience, and all potential listeners to that speech? That's important. Number 3, assess the speaker's reasoning. We'll get into this a little bit more in depth when we talk about logical fallacies and things like this, but generally, assess that speaker's reasoning. What logic are they using to sell you their idea? Does it seem to be logically consistent and coherent across the entire speech, right? And what kind of logic are they using? Again, we'll get into that more in depth later. 4th, consider multiple perspectives. And this is important here because, again, it should be that you are looking at the speech not just how you would perceive it and those specific biases that you might have and those heuristics you might have, but really think about how other people might be seeing that speech. What would another listener from a different background, from a different culture, from a different religious perspective, from a different ideological perspective, how might that different person look at this speaker? And if you can do perspective taking, what we call perspective taking, the act of actually trying to think about that particular speech from another person's perspective, and from lots of different perspectives, you're going to do a much better job analyzing and thinking about what this speaker is doing culturally. Lastly here, summarize and assess relevant facts and evidence. So this is actually really important to do, and I highly recommend, if you're listening to a speech, to make up your mind about an issue. It could be a political issue. It could be something you're going to buy. Someone's persuading you to buy something, right? Actually summarize, or a habit that they're trying to get you to do, summarize what that speaker is saying for yourself. A little bulleted list. What are some relevant facts that they're actually putting out there? Do they have a thesis statement? Are they direct in what they're trying to get you to do? Do they provide real evidence? And again, always as a listener, check on that evidence. It's one of the reasons why, as a speaker we'll talk about later, it's so important to cite your sources out loud, because your audience gets one shot, one opportunity to hear everything you're going to say or let it slip. It's really important though. With evidence, right, when we as a listener can go look up that evidence, go kind of check in on where you pull that information from, and when we know that that evidence came from somewhere, not just made up out of your head, then that gives us so much more credibility to your argument. All right, let's move on here. Next thing I want to do is teach the DIET model. So the DIET model is a model of basically analysis and criticism, right? So there's 4 parts to the DIET model: describe, interpret, evaluate, theorize. I'll break down each one of these. But essentially what this is a model of analyzing any performance. Now I teach this in a lot of different classes. In public speaking, right, we are analyzing, let's say, live speeches and performances of that kind of nature. But I also teach this in acting classes, where we might analyze a scene or a play or a film potentially, right? You can use this method of analysis for anything, even a video game. In fact, this is a great method of criticism, and if you're ever looking for a good critical, like if you ever need to write basically a criticism paper or a reflection paper on having watched some live performance, you can use this model, use individual paragraphs for each of these sections, and you'll really have a much more in-depth kind of review. So what this is meant to do, if you want to note this, this model is meant to suspend knee-jerk reactions that we have to criticizing a piece of performance. So let's say you go see a film. Typically you go see a film and then you go talk about it to your friend afterwards. What do you usually say? What's the first thing you say? It's usually, "It was awesome, I loved it a lot," or "It sucked," right? That's not particularly useful information, is it? Right? Whether it was really great or really terrible, in your perspective, that's not going to help me understand whether or not I might like it, right? So the DIET model it makes you sound more educated and it gives you a little bit more substance to talk about, but B, it also is a better model of reflection and criticism because it can actually help, as we'll get into, those performers, those speakers, if they do see your criticism, it can help them be better and get better at speaking because it can really see what's going on there. So let's break each piece of the diet model down. So the first part we start with is describe. And if you were to do this diet model in a reflection, think of these as a good paragraph or two for each of these sections, especially for the first section. Here you need to describe the scene, the speech, for instance, or the film or whatever it is, in rich detail. Rich detail. So think about everything that happens, all of the aspects here. The staging, how people are standing. Are they using a mic? Or are they speaking to an audience? Do they have a podium? If it's a performance, what does the stage look like? What does the set look like? The use of voice. All of these things we call paralinguistics. So the volume, the rate of speech, or the speed, the way that certain vocal choices are made, pauses, gesturing, right? How, is that happening during the speech? And what is happening with that? How the speaker is dressed, every single word they say, anything you can describe about that scene. Now here's the important part about the describe section. We can all agree on the description level of the diet model. Anyone watching this can agree on the objective facts of this person said these things, right? Every word they said, right? They dressed this way, they wore this color tie, they had this kind of speech, they used these vocal intonations. I'll post up a video that I normally have us watch in class, and I have us practice the diet model on it. I'd actually love for you to watch this video and then practice the diet model on it a little bit, right? And in that video, you'll see there's two young women. They're doing a performance poem, and essentially they are, this is from many, many, many years ago, they are looking at some social, cultural, religious issues from two different perspectives, right? From a Jewish and a Muslim perspective. Really interesting piece of performance poetry. We could think of it as public speech or as poetry performance, but it's interesting for the diet model, right? Because we can think about all of the things they do on stage. That's the description level. How they're dressed, how you'll see use their hand gestures, moments that they have of connecting their hands, moments that they say things together, moments that they say things in different places, and all of those objective descriptions would be in that describe level. But notice here, we have not moved to say that those were good, to say anything else about them. We are just in pure objective description here. And again, if we, as a class, got together, 35 people or however many people got together, and we talked about all of these different aspects, we could probably spell out every single thing that happened on that stage. But then we get to the interpret level. So this is owning your own interpretations of what happened in a speech, in a performance, given your description. So this is where you start to think about, what was that speaker intending? What do you think they were intending? And because you are spelling out what you think happened, you are owning your own interpretation of the situation. So this means you might have a different interpretation of what the speaker was saying than I do. We both might come from different perspectives, different backgrounds, different regions of the country, different religious affiliations, cultural affiliations, whatever. You might see something unique and different that I might not. Or you might have a take on what you think that that person was doing. Here's the thing. If you spell out that interpretation for an audience, it teaches us something about the way that you're seeing that performance. Does that make sense? And so here, you're not moving to judgment. We haven't done any judgment. You're not saying it's good or it's bad, and you're not critiquing any particular part. Here, we're just spelling out what you think happened and what you think the artist was doing in that particular piece, right? And again, it's okay to have different interpretations, right? We might have a scene, right, in which there's an awkward hug, right? And one person might interpret that awkward hug means, this couple doesn't look like they're going to be together much longer. And another person might interpret, oh, well, actually, this is a very appropriate hug because of all the awkward things that have happened in their past. And maybe a third person would say, well, it's coronavirus time, so yeah, clearly we don't even want to be hugging. So even an awkward hug is more than we might otherwise get, right? We might all have different interpretations of how we perceive that scene, and that's okay. If we spell out those interpretations for the person reading our criticism, that teaches us something about how you as a unique person are reading that performance, right? So for instance, we might look at the description of, you'll see these two young women holding hands in certain places, doing simultaneous action and speech at different times. We might say that those two, for instance, I might interpret that they're trying to show unity through their verbal and through their physical choices. That might be an interpretation, maybe a religious unity or global unity or whatever. That might be an interpretation that I take away from those specific descriptive choices. So again, we haven't moved to saying whether that's good or bad or anything yet. And if we spend a good time here in interpretation, I'm starting to see again, description, some of those choices that you saw happening, interpretation, what you think those choices were doing, and then evaluation. So this is where you give your judgments of the performance informed by those previous levels. Now, this is where we do judge. This is where we provide some sort of judgment on that particular performance. But that being said, note kind of how I'm couching it here. We don't just go, oh, yeah, it's great or it's not. No. We give it some nuance here. We say something like this maybe. The speaker's use of tone was good because, right? Because it was indicative of someone who is really passionate about their subject matter and it really resonated with me as an audience member. Now, that's useful. That's advice that performer can then go read and take back and say, oh, wow, the thing I was doing with my voice was working. Or maybe you could be critical. The pacing didn't work because. And note, I'm talking about the pacing. And here, that's interesting feedback. You're spelling out why something different worked and what that specific thing was. Okay, that person could then take that criticism and go, oh, yeah, okay, work on pacing. Maybe I should slow my speaking down just a little bit, right? Or finally, the organization was excellent because they used a chronological organization. It really worked in these kinds of ways. So evaluate is essentially, think of it as a paragraph or a section where you start to talk about the different things that maybe were working, weren't working, and really kind of give those judgments about the piece. But notice here how we're so much more nuanced. We're talking about specific aspects of a speech, a performance, a film, a video game, anything you want to write criticism on, right? We're evaluating, we're giving judgment, we're doing so about specific things. This makes you look more articulate as a reviewer. This makes you also give information to that performer who can then do better next time giving you criticism. Does that make sense? All right, let's move on to the last piece here. This is theorize. Two different ways of looking at theorization. The first one might be to look at many similar performances and theorize connections across those. Now look, y'all, I've been teaching speech for over a decade. I have seen tens of thousands of speeches. No joke, okay? So, when I look at a speaker, I am comparing that to thousands of other similar speeches that I have seen in my past, right? Whether it be professionals or students, right? I'm looking at something that I can compare against. Now, most of you aren't going to have that unless you specialize in something like this. But everyone can do the second part. And so most students, whenever they do a theorized section of a diet model for me, they typically do the second part. They do what an old professor of mine would call taking something away in your to-go cup. So think of it this way. If you were to leave this performance, right? If you were to take anything away from this performance as you leave it, right? As you watch this performance, and I hope you do check out this video. It's really cool kind of performance poetry. If there's something you were going to take away from that, let's say to apply to a similar performance or to a similar speech or poetry reading or whatever that you might do in the future, what might that thing be? This could be something really useful or interesting that the speakers were doing, something that, oh man, if I ever do anything like this, I'm going to make sure that I use voice in this way, use body in this way, dress in a certain way, speak a certain way, project a certain way, engage the audience a certain way. Or it could be something that you don't want to do based on seeing a speaker, something you didn't like, or something that wasn't effective. Wow, the speaker's use of lighting and a particular color lighting really didn't work for this particular circumstance. Oh, the microphone, they spoke into the microphone, but it really wasn't very audible. And maybe it would be better not to use that. That's great. Anything you can take away from a speech so that if you were to perform a similar kind of speech in the future, again, taking away something in your to-go cup that you'd be able to do on your particular performance. All right. So a couple of videos here posted. Like I said, I hope you go check those out. That'll be it for today. We'll have a few more lectures coming up in the next few days where we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of writing your speech. But for now, I hope that you all have an excellent day, and I'm looking forward to looking at your videos. All right, y'all. Take care.